session is Peggy Ewanyshyn from University of Alberta Libraries, and thank you very much for coming so far. We're grateful. And Peggy is going to be talking about concerns around digitisation projects in an Indigenous community. Okay, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I would like to apologize in advance, but I'm going to probably be overly reliant on my notes because it's about 4 a.m. my time, and I'm afraid if I wing it, I will probably get very tongue-tied. So I apologize, but I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to, as Ian introduced, talking about a specific case study with an Indigenous community that it's a narrow focus, but it should tell you a bit more about some of the concerns with projects that involve Indigenous communities. So I'm going to begin. In Smith's seminal work for the Council on Library and Information Resources, Why Digitize?, she cautions that in contemplating a digital conversion project, an institution must ask itself what can be gained from digitization and whether the value added is worth the price. In an Indigenous context, the potential price is not merely monetary, but the risk of cultural appropriation as well. In an Indigenous community setting, such projects need to take into account the role of restricted Indigenous knowledge, which is IK, when deciding whether or not a digitization project should be mounted at all. The qualitative case study that I will be discussing today focused on the perceptions of digital projects in an Indigenous setting. The topic intersects with issues related to cultural heritage and museum studies, the repatriation of Indigenous artifacts, and digital projects. The primary goal of this study was to enhance the understanding of an Indigenous community as it faces decisions regarding the presentation of its cultural heritage. The perspectives of stakeholders in an Indigenous community were sought to illuminate the issues related to digitizing Indigenous cultural heritage so that future digital initiatives in this community can be rooted in the perceptions of user needs gathered during this and future studies. The study attempted to demonstrate that valuable insights can be obtained by identifying perceived user needs through discussion with stakeholders, even in an Indigenous community that has yet to conceive of a digitization project. It is with the spirit of the following words that you can see on the screen here in mind that the study proceeded. People and their information needs are central to all libraries, digital or otherwise, and therefore all efforts to design, implement, and evaluate digital libraries must be rooted in the information needs, characteristics, and context of the people who will or may use those libraries. The following research questions drove the study. What are the issues that affect the development of services to meet the needs and wants of an Indigenous community? What are the cultural inhibitors to providing digital content? And would digitization be accepted as an appropriate additional mode of communicating traditional values and beliefs and preserving cultural heritage and Indigenous knowledge? In light of the notion that new technologies could be used to record and document cultural information before it is lost, the study explored the issues surrounding the viability of an Indigenous digitization project. The upsurge in interest in Indigenous knowledge management arises from several concerns, namely the availability of technology with enhanced capabilities that may be particularly effective in Indigenous environments, and the unease caused by cultural appropriation and unacceptable uses of sacred items. Social issues such as alcoholism and the attendant violence, domestic abuse, and drug abuse have steadily grown since the introduction of alcohol by traders. Poverty, isolation, and the conflict between traditional and mainstream life have exacted a toll that is difficult to measure and difficult to rectify. Underpinning any investigation of Indigenous peoples are these factors which have fostered in many communities an understandable lack of trust of the non-Aboriginal population. Consider that Canada, although it endorsed it in 2010, only in 2016 officially removed its objector status to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, nearly a decade after it was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Implementing the declaration will still take significant time. Although Indigenous communities received an official apology from the government for its treatment of children in residential schools in 2008, the same year the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created, it was under the leadership of the same government that resisted opening an inquiry into the disproportionately high number of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls in Canada. With a different political party currently in power in Canada, there has been a renewal of commitments to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and a sense of optimism and that things will improve, including such things that are taken for granted in urban areas, such as improved access to potable water on reserves. Some background on the community studied. The Stoney Nakoda Nation, with a registered population under 5,000 people, is one of 45 First Nations in Alberta and is made up of 3 bands, each with its own chief and councillors in different historical hunting grounds. The locations of the 3 main reserves reflect somewhat these historical differences. However, the majority of the unreserved Stoney Nakoda population live in the town of Morley, an hour west of Calgary. The Stoney language has less than 3,000 speakers and is considered a vulnerable language. Recently, a plaque was erected at the spot of Saskatchewan Crossing in Banff National Park. The plaque reads, "These mountains are our sacred places," the title of the late Chief John Snow's History of the Stoney People, in which he interweaves Nakota stories throughout the text. His interest in knowledge sharing is underlined even further when he closes his book by calling for global sharing of the stories of the Stoney people. It is hoped that this study furthered his work by examining how to best capture the traditional Stoney Nakoda culture in a way that can be shared globally, while at the same time helping the community preserve itself into the future in the face of modern pressures. And you will see many quotes from his book on my slides. From the perspectives of members of the Stoney Nakoda community, where the concept of digital collections of artifacts is relatively new, the following questions illustrate areas where further information was desired. In what ways are digitized Indigenous cultural heritage resources being used? And in what ways are communities benefiting from allowing digitized images of the resources to be accessible to the general public? As IK will be discussed at length, it is important to consider how IK is defined. The definitions do range significantly, but most try to illustrate the many types and applications of Indigenous knowledge that exist in a variety of circumstances. Razaroka's interpretation of IK sharing seems particularly to possess universal application. IK sharing is part of the traditional transfer of culture and skills through learning that is facilitated by elders who have competence acquired through practice, experience, and wisdom for the benefit of younger apprentices and community of skills over generations. The effects of colonization cannot be separated from a discussion of Aboriginal experience. There has never been a system of imposing Indigenous knowledge on other peoples. This is suggested by Dumbrell and Green, but tradition dictates that listening and observing others is a means to learning. IK is gaining a certain legitimacy in academia and education. However, it is typically framed in Eurocentric context, or at worst absorbed and appropriated by Eurocentric learning institutions. Brown proposes promoting the wider appreciation of Indigenous heritage and encouraging frank public discussion about the enduring legacy of colonialism through diverse strategies. Krupnik states that appealing heritage materials may trigger new interest in certain traditional activities that were considered lost for generations. He warns that the records of traditional culture may be growing, but the relevant oral knowledge is fading in local memory and use. He details the irony that the generously shared knowledge of Indigenous societies collected by anthropologists early on now has to be shared in turn with the same communities, which he refers to as knowledge repatriation. Krupnik also details how knowledge restrictions included those related to family, gender, age, and status. Online projects may want to take such traditional restrictions into account. Fully suggests that the oral tradition and the possibilities afforded by internet-based technology have a similar strength, that is, in their ability to morph, to foster adaptation and innovation via highly patterned, powerful language. This aligns fully with others who view the internet as the ideal next medium for transmitting IK. Examining the successes of Indigenous community museums is relevant in the context of the study, as the Stoney Nakoda Nation does not have a cultural center at this stage, and it could be argued that a digital project would naturally follow such a development. Hoopler notes that the loss of material culture to museums has ensured a certain detachment on the part of community members who may be unfamiliar with their cultural heritage and a subsequent loss of pride. This is why self-presentation, so that community members write their own history, is encouraged. Huller suggests that this form of community museum may prove to be an antidote to previous approaches that either ignore input from Indigenous people themselves or are otherwise insensitive to the needs of the community. The methodology involved qualitative research. It was selected as a research problem warranted an in-depth study of the perceptions of individuals. A qualitative case study design was deemed most appropriate because Yin recommends using the case study method to understand a real-life phenomenon in depth, if such understanding includes important contextual conditions as it does in the circumstances under study. Constructivist case studies provide rich pictures of individuals and their interaction with processes, social relationships, and organizational frameworks. The research aimed to discover what cultural inhibitors exist to providing digital content and which issues affect the development of services that would best meet the needs and wants of the community studied. The main inhibitors are fear of exploitation and lack of support for cultural initiatives. The issues that affect the development of services tend to be social, political, and economic in nature. The themes that emerged from the data that was collected were highly interrelated. To focus today's discussion, I will address these issues briefly in light of the responses of a single interviewee, a teenager who I will call Kyla. I will first give you a sample of the portrait that came out of the data analysis. Consider it a snapshot of one of the informants of the study. Portrait of Kyla. Her nostalgia for the past, when her grandfather would take her to the places where he grew up and to sacred sites, is palpable. She wonders how he spent his free time, what he and others used to do for fun, and she regrets not asking while she had the opportunity. Her comments illustrate plainly her concern for young people losing touch with the old ways. She's disappointed that sharing is strictly occurring at the family level and no longer at the community level in the form of sun dances or storytelling. Kyla really values community gatherings, and powwow dancing for her is clearly another way to bring people together. Kyla actively uses technology like the internet, but strictly for emails and schoolwork. She is very responsive to the notion of web access to stories in particular, as she holds stories to be so dear. When she speaks of her Aboriginal Studies course, she notes the lack of guest speakers. It is ironic that in an environment that values oral transmission, the learning would come solely from a book. She suggests that young people need the guidance of elders and parents and is grateful that she can still consult with her mother. She is conscious not to cross any boundaries or tell a story if she doesn't have the details correct. At the same time, when she speaks, she exhibits an enthusiasm and a lack of inhibition characteristic of young people everywhere. She doesn't necessarily recognize that she actively passes on her cultural heritage through her dancing. She must be very strong, as she has had to take a stand to live her life without alcohol. That tension between traditional life and contemporary life is difficult to reconcile, but she seems particularly mature and capable. Social issues affect the continued transfer of IK within the community. These can include addictions, isolation, unemployment, crime, poor health care, poverty, inadequate schooling. Kyla blamed alcohol as a factor in the loss of IK. Consider for a moment, what would you prioritize if you didn't have access to clean drinking water? Economics are a factor in cultural heritage decisions for two reasons. Firstly, the acquisition of initial funding and recouping the costs associated with a project need to be secured before projects can be mandated. Secondly, the emphasis in the community tends to favor building things that are not loss leaders, like a cultural institution would inevitably be. In addition, unanticipated costs need to be factored into proposed projects, such as paying participants for their time. Unlike partners from instigating institutions, community members may have to take time off work in order to participate and should be fairly compensated for their time and their wealth of knowledge. Politics plays a role in the community's ability to respond and act. Bands within the nation do not necessarily share the same priorities and in fact often find agreement impossible to achieve. In addition, the judgment of mainstream society comes into play. For example, the community has been the target of criticism of its handling of funds. In addition, the community also had no means of properly storing what few artifacts remained local. When Kyla was asked if she had seen traditional Stoney artifacts, she replied, "No, I haven't, but I have seen old locations like where my grandfather grew up, where he used to play. I know of sacred areas, but I haven't seen artifacts related to those areas." One manner in which Aboriginal cultures are exploited is when misrepresentative stories are disseminated by anthropologists who have misinterpreted Indigenous traditions. Often tales of cultural practices have the effect of creating or reinforcing stereotypes. Public perception is important, especially in the modern context when technology allows the media unprecedented access to private lives. For Kyla, if an online collection existed, she felt that she would use it and expressed no qualms about using it. This demonstrates that for the younger generation that has grown up with technology, fear of its negative ramifications may not exist. Lack of support for cultural heritage undertakings may be due to lack of exposure to such initiatives, lack of interest, uncertainty as to appropriateness, or an attitude that loss is meant to be. Alcohol abuse may have ramifications for cultural heritage. It can even, in the long term, result in a disinterest that pervades the community. Kyla claimed, "We used to do sun dances. It doesn't happen anymore. It's really changed. The elders who used to do it are sadly passing on. They may have either shown their siblings how to keep the ceremonies going. However, with alcohol in the reserve, some parents haven't passed them on to their daughters." The continued existence of Aboriginal languages and cultures is threatened by lack of connection within the extended family, lack of time due to other responsibilities and pressures, and the passing away of the keepers of the languages and cultures before they are able to transfer their knowledge. Age may be another factor in dwindling interest in cultural activities, as Kyla underlines repeatedly. A long time ago, we would have ceremonies where we would all gather to tell stories and listen to each other together. Now it is hard to get young people to an event like that. Young people want to be with their friends now. They don't think it's important that they should even bother. The younger generation aren't getting into it. It is important to remember that most of today's young people were born of parents who were sent to residential schools where they were forcibly disconnected from their culture. So even if their children today are taught the community's language at school, without ongoing conversation at home, languages learned in school will not flourish or become integrated into daily life. Across Canada's Aboriginal communities, many youth lack interest in learning their languages and cultures, especially in areas where traditional cultures and values have been lost. The modernization of reserve life has resulted in fewer daily stories to share and a shrinking pool of good storytellers, to say nothing about curious listeners. Currently, there is considerable interest in the lives of Indigenous peoples, especially as Indigenous communities struggle to maintain their cultures amidst the uniformity of the ever-engulfing mainstream culture. Armed with the latest technological offerings, several Indigenous communities in Canada and beyond have experienced breakthroughs that have led to a renaissance of their traditional culture. At the same time, the scrutiny that such technology allows has actually caused some Indigenous groups to retreat into the background and reserve their spot on the internet for a later date. Until such time when Indigenous peoples feel that their IK will be honored and respected, some will be as reluctant to deposit their cultural memory online as they are to deposit it in a memory institution. One of the most significant findings of the study was that there are many issues facing the community that interfere with its ability to actively promote cultural heritage through digital initiatives. The study illuminated that social issues like alcohol abuse, political issues like infighting, and economic issues like inadequate funding may continue to impede the uptake of digital initiatives of IK by this Indigenous community. In order for this particular community to be truly responsive to the needs of its inhabitants, a digital project has to come from within, with elders engaged from the start. The most promising Indigenous digital initiatives seem to stem from a community's openness to embracing technology, eagerness to share their cultural heritage, and willingness to experiment. The benefits of mixing technology with IK include not only preservation of the culture, but also fostering increased awareness of traditions within a community, increased pride at being affiliated with a community, and increased transfer of traditional values to youth who are compelled to assist elders with the technology. But with this online participation comes the threat that IK will be stolen or misused. Cultural appropriation sadly continues, as demonstrated by sites where pseudo-Indigenous peoples tout sacred knowledge for a price. Programs that require users of websites to create a detailed profile have been implemented to reduce the likelihood that restricted information will be exploited. Developing a set of guidelines for such a profile that caters uniquely to the needs of the Stoney Nakoda community members may be a stepping stone to developing the cultural heritage policies that the community currently lacks. Since the study was conducted, the community became involved in a digital initiative. It could be argued that the increased awareness of the goals of digitization made the community more amenable to participating in this project, which gathers together openly accessible audio files of stories told by elders about the wild horses in the area. In addition, more Stoney Nakoda websites have appeared, such as this one, with more in-depth information available, including language and stories. It is critical that communities maintain control over IK that they intend to adapt to an online environment, as cultural misinterpretation and misrepresentation occurs when communities are not involved in the presentation and interpretation of their artistic and cultural expressions, and fear of such action causes understandable hesitation among Indigenous communities like the one investigated. People in the community need to be trained on how to use technology to promote its use as a tool. When I attended the UNESCO Memory of the World in the Digital Age Digitization and Preservation Conference in 2012, I was pleased that there were many sessions that touched on issues of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous intellectual property rights. The same themes that came out in the study were mentioned, such as the risk that making IK accessible online makes it vulnerable to misappropriation and misuse. It was also emphasized that not all Indigenous peoples want the same kind of protection of their traditional cultural expression. The protection of Indigenous intellectual property needs to be balanced with the potential loss of access to ancestral knowledge and property. Cultural and sharing platforms continue to be developed that allow Indigenous communities to define levels of access and circulation. Mkurtu was presented at that conference, the development of which began in 2007, and Digitization has been around since 2010. Last week, I was at an Arctic Library Portal workshop in Washington where a speaker mentioned the various tools that the National Snow and Ice Data Center have been developing, including Aloka, which provides data management and user support and fosters collaboration between resident Arctic experts and visiting researchers. When I spoke with her later about how much I appreciated her perspective on developing community relationships, she said that they have spent years building relationships with elders in the communities she works with. The relationship building piece is of critical importance and yet is still often overlooked for the sake of launching quick and dirty digitization projects as funding becomes available. In the last few weeks, I've had several requests come across my desk to assist with a variety of First Nations communities in Alberta who are preparing to apply for grant funding to get their own digitization efforts off the ground. As the university I work for outsources our digitization activities, we're not well positioned to advise on how to set up one-off or small-scale digitization efforts. But my biggest concern is with the sustainability of such a project if, as remains the case, the grant funding doesn't address the long-term maintenance and preservation storage costs. How can a community ensure that their collection will live on in digital form? At the same time as I'm inclined to offer our support with the hosting and preservation storage of the content, I worry that we will be seen as yet another gatekeeper. This is part of a tension as an outsider that I was confronted with throughout the study. The archival images used in this presentation are from the digitized collection of postcards on the Peel's Prairie Province's website, which I administer at the University of Alberta. The photos are in the public domain in Canada and have been openly available online for more than a decade. I hope they serve to illustrate that in many, if not most cases, the bulk of historical artifacts from Indigenous communities do not reside within the community. Instead, outside institutions continue to determine access. I've noticed recently that consideration of the ethics of digitization is gaining traction as awareness grows that some things, whether in Indigenous context or not, even materials considered to be public, were never intended to be broadly distributed. Without context and understanding, many cultural resources could be used to paint an erroneously an edifying interpretation of the people depicted. To conclude on a positive note, Krupnik insists that we usually know much more about Indigenous cultural losses than of endurance and cultural revival. Hopefully the trend toward endurance and revival will continue, as long as that proves to be what the community wants. Finally, I want to emphasize that not all people of Indigenous descent will feel the same way about the issues I've described, even within the same Indigenous community, as their experiences and resultant perspectives will be as individual as yours and mine. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to all the speakers. We've heard some very interesting research and very diverse research. Even though we're running a little late, I'd like to get the speakers together, if you wouldn't mind, maybe sitting in the seats there, and we'll have a kind of shorter than planned discussion, question answer session, because I think what we've heard today, this morning, is raised some very, very interesting points, and I'd like to give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask any questions or to raise any discussion points. We have a microphone on the table and a microphone for questions. Does anybody have any questions to kick us off? To any of the speakers or to the panel in general?
I thought I'd kick off while we're warming up, both physically and maybe intellectually. The duty manager of the Kelvin Hall did promise he'll turn the air conditioning down, but I think they need to contact the contractor, so fingers crossed. I was trying to, listening to all four of you was really interesting, and I was thinking with the first two being European projects, and the others really diverse geographically, whether because Enumerate, as well as the Europeana Research and Europeana Cloud, have been here a longer period, because Ali and the rest of the team with Scotland Sound sort of said, you're just about to start the approach, and it was very interesting to see the Canadian kind of in the indigenous community perspective. I was wondering about what can be permeated. So in a sense, from Enumerate and Europeana Cloud, do you think there are any lessons that actually, you know, I'm not even going to mention the B word, kind of Brexit, but are there things that you think really could work from this experience beyond the European context? And maybe some tips or something that you think can be shared, that can be more widely applicable when, you know, I think all four of you were kind of grappling how can we cater for the users better and how can we incorporate kind of this life cycle. So I suppose it's more for Marco and Agiati.
Well, I think I take two things from these perspectives. I think the one was what was already in your opening presentation is that we need both quantitative and qualitative information, and I think especially the final two were very showing the importance of how a qualitative element is essential to really understand the value that you're doing. So it's not just about facts and figures. And the second thing I take away is that even though, you know, in Enumerate we try to present the bigger picture, as I said, with the core issues, but it really shows how different local context can be. So it's also, again, maybe that also relates to the quantity and quality, but I think the local context is so important to understand that value. And I think that both approaches, you know, try to, maybe, as I said, with Enumerate, we try to also convince the, you know, the people that fund us to make them show how we spend the money on a very generic level. But I think it's the value from these local kinds of initiatives that's really at the heart of why we're doing the things that we are doing. So.
Yes. Well, very briefly, I think that what Peggy Sue's presentation also really showcases that community engagement is an exercise on its own, and, you know, identifying who your users or your audience, or call them what you may, are is one big thing, but engaging with them and, you know, getting them on board and getting them to realize that they're part of the project, they are the project, is one big thing. And what we, well, you actually mentioned the B word, Brexit. The lesson learned from Europeana Research, the grants call that ran these past few months, is that the more open you are, the more likely it is that your users are going to surprise you, and in a good way. Yes, and speaking on behalf of the Europeana Research team, we found out that, you know, engaging with them and bringing them on board and actually making them believe that they are part of our idea and our work is the key to the success. Is key to sustainability, key to impact, and everybody gets pleasantly surprised. And may I just repeat how happy we were that we did get applications from Canada, and we did get applications from Japan. So this says something about European cultural heritage, and it does say something about the mission of Europeana, but it goes beyond that. It goes to say that, you know, there are people somewhere in Brazil interested in using Europeana to do some research on Rembrandt. And this says it all. I think this is what we're working on, and this is what's important.
Thank you.
Can I just add something? I think Europeana is held to a certain standard in very high regard. So we look to what Europeana is doing. So I'm here so that I can learn more about ways to evaluate what we're doing, because there aren't a lot of sessions on that in Canada or North America in general.
Thank you. Harry, you had a question?
Yes. Well, first of all, very impressed by all the speakers, especially Peggy with that jet lag. I was super impressed how you got all of that so articulated. Fantastic. What struck me very much is how much in depth you went into these communities. I think that was the real strength of your research. Now, as Agati said, Europeana is mostly a sea, some even say an ocean of data. It's big. It's large, we deal with many institutions, etc. Do you have any practical recommendations how we could go in depth, like you did in your own case, and get that real value out, in terms of balancing that with the efforts that you need to put in there?
I would say that it was the interviews, and not setting up the interview questions without knowing what the answers are going to be. And it was also a very small case study, but as the case often is with qualitative case studies, you only need a small sampling to actually start hearing the same things and reaching the same insights. There were limitations of my study. For example, I was not able to interview an elder, which I think was a serious limitation. I was promised an elder along the way throughout the study, and it never came to be. And that really had to do with, it would have taken me a couple years within that community before I would have been granted that access. And I was naive at the beginning, and then it became very clear, and since then it has been articulated again and again that in Indigenous settings you really need to build that relationship and that trust. So so I would just say that even if you don't have that many people that you're interviewing, you can still get very rich information.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a final question? I'm sensing your question is, can we have coffee? Yes, you can. But before that, please join me in thanking our speakers for the wonderful efforts this morning.